friends, Sarah here from Sunset Bow, and I wanted to just do a quick video walking through a new deck that I received today, because today I received my new copy of the 3rd edition of the Darkness of Light Tarot, and I wanted to compare it to the 2nd edition Darkness of Light, which I also have. It's a deck that I really love. I was really kind of debating whether or not I wanted to get the 3rd edition, because as you can see, the aesthetic is quite different, but I did know that I use this deck enough that I didn't mind having a backup for it, and I was very curious to see how I would feel about the 3rd edition when I saw it in person. So in terms of what comes with the two decks, just sort of the outward accoutrements of the decks, the box is pretty much the same for the 3rd edition as it was for the 2nd edition. I don't have my 2nd edition box out to compare, but it really is pretty much exactly the same. I did get the one signed by the artist, who is Tony DeMoro. This deck does not come with any kind of booklet or anything like that. It is a quite easy deck to read because it's really mostly a Rider-Waite-Smith clone. There are some discrepancies, but for the most part it really is extremely easy to read if you're familiar with RWS system. So it doesn't come with any kind of guidebook or anything like that. The deck does come with a fabric bag to keep the deck in. This is the bag that I actually keep with my 2nd edition copy, so this is the bag that deck has been living in. The bag that comes with the 3rd edition is identical. It's the exact same bag, and it has the same silk screen on it of the wolves that are on the back of the deck. So you can see that when the two decks are placed right next to each other, they are basically identical in height. So there isn't an actual difference in the thickness of the cardstock, but what I will say is when you hold an individual card, the cardstock of the 3rd edition does feel quite a bit sturdier than the cardstock of the 2nd edition. I know a lot of people have really criticized the cardstock of both the 1st and 2nd editions of this deck, and I will admit that I have always found that it does have a bit of a cardboardy, kind of almost cereal boxy kind of feel to the cardstock of this deck, and it also does tend to chip very easily, which, as you can imagine, on a deck that has a very dark aesthetic like this, any chipping on the deck tends to be very, very visible on the edges. So I have actually edged mine in black Sharpie, which does kind of take care of the chipping problem, and I've had to touch it up a few times after heavy use to make sure that the chipping doesn't start to become apparent again. Obviously, having the white borders on the new edition of the deck will help with potential chipping problems, but it also does feel like the cardstock is a bit sturdier. It has more of a card-like feel to the cardstock as opposed to a slightly more cardboardy feel to the 2nd edition. And the cardstock, weirdly, in the 3rd edition actually feels thicker, even though I can clearly tell you that it isn't actually, because the two decks stacked up next to each other are identical. So in terms of the backs of the decks, again, you can see there's a different aesthetic between the 2nd edition, which is the darker version, and the 3rd edition. We have these two wolves on the back. It's a photo negative rendition of the wolves on the 3rd edition. There is a slight difference in that you can see that on this one it is just the wolves on the back, but on the 3rd edition there's this very sort of intricate mandala kind of overlaying, it looks like a spirograph, honestly, pattern that overlays the wolves on the back. I think I prefer the 2nd edition, but the 3rd edition is still cool. The one thing I will note too is that the cards are identical in size, but if you do put them right next to each other, just make sure I don't get any glare here, you can see that the border, both top and bottom, is wider on the 3rd edition. The white is quite a bit wider than the black border is on the second edition. It's just like a solid 2 millimeters, I'd say, wider on the top border and at least a millimeter wider on the bottom border, which means that if you do look closely, you can see that there is a little bit more cropping of the image in the third edition than there was in the second edition, which is kind of a shame, but again, it's a couple millimeters, so it's really not significantly noticeable. But, you know, definitely just something to consider when, you know, considering the differences between the two decks. I've actually gone through both of these already and compared them because I already tried to film this video once and I got to the end and I realized that I'd actually filmed the entire thing on slow-mo, which was ridiculous, as you can imagine. But so I'm redoing it now. But so I actually have already gone through and compared the decks to each other, and there are almost no differences in the actual artwork, which is interesting. You know, when the second edition came out, there was quite a difference between the first edition and the second edition, both because the first edition had side borders in addition to the top and bottom borders, and the second edition made it borderless on the sides, which is quite nice. And then there was also some changes in the tonality of the artwork from the first edition to the second edition. You know, some cards got a little bit more sepia toned, some cards got a little bit more gray toned. So there definitely were some changes. I have noticed almost no changes between the second and third edition. There are a couple of cards that are very, very slightly different. And when I say slightly different, what I mean is that I have been able to detect actual differences as opposed to, you know, it's easy to sort of let your eye get fooled into thinking that there are differences just because, you know, of the having white offsetting the image as opposed to black. But for the most part, I think the cards are actually pretty close to identical. There's only a few cards where I think there is actually a little bit of a change in the coloration of the artwork. And aside from coloration, there are no other differences in the artwork. So I'm going to go ahead and just kind of start flipping through these and pointing out differences where I see them. Oh, one other thing that is different about this third edition is that, you know, whereas again it's in Italian, this deck has always been in Italian. Some of the Italian was corrected from the first edition to the second edition, but nothing has changed for the third edition. But instead of having the numbers for the majors up at the top here, they put a little dot with the number in it, which is kind of cool looking, but you know, again, it doesn't make a huge amount of difference to me. But I'm just going to go ahead and flip through these kind of quickly. Now, for my part, I think from an aesthetic standpoint, I pretty strongly prefer the second edition. You know, this deck is called the Darkness of Light Tarot, and I like the fact that it's dark. It's something I enjoy. It's not a dark feeling deck from an emotional standpoint. You know, it definitely is just the aesthetic. It's, you know, it's not a deck where I sort of feel like it has a dark ethos in any way. It's just a dark aesthetic. You know, it's not the kind of thing where I'd be like, oh, this is a deck for shadow work or anything like that. Like, I don't mean dark in that sense, but I do like the dark aesthetic of it. And I do feel like there's more continuity and between the image and the borders in the dark version as opposed to the light version. The borders kind of pop a little too much in the light version. Not that it's not pretty. I do think it's very pretty, but I think I do prefer, again, the darker edition. Now, this is a card where I did actually see a bit of a difference between the two editions. It isn't incredibly apparent, but if you look at the skin tones, there's a little bit more of a pinkish cast to the skin tones in the second edition than there is in the third edition, where the skin is quite a bit more gray feeling. So this is one of the cards where I did notice a difference between the two, but you know, you might not even be able to see it on camera. It is very, very subtle. And this is another one too where I think And again, I'm hoping my eye is not just being fooled by the differences in the borders, but I believe there's a slight bit more pink to the skin tones in the second edition card than there is in the third edition card. Now, one of the really cool things about this deck that I've always really loved is that there's a little bit of almost color coding to the minors, where you can kind of see when we get into the wands, there's a very sort of pinkish hue to all of the background. Again, I think that the actual artwork colors are very similar, if not exactly the same, in most of the cards, but there are a few differences that I have perceived in some of them. Again, they're incredibly subtle and not exactly easy to discern with the naked eye, and definitely doesn't show up very well on camera, but I'll point those out where I have noticed them. This is another example where, again, I think that the skin tones in and just the overall card in the second edition is quite a bit pinker than in the third edition. There's a little bit more of a purplish undertone in this one than there is in the second edition. You can see that some of the pinks down at the bottom here aren't as bright in the third edition as they are in the second edition, but again, super subtle. I don't even know if you'll be able to see it on camera. It's just an extremely subtle difference. Then there are other cards where I don't honestly think that there is a difference at all. So, but I do love this deck. I use it a lot. I love the artwork of it. It has kind of a serious feel to it, but it's very beautiful. And again, you know, it's just very much a Rider-Waite-Smith style deck, so it is quite an easy read. So you can see here when we get into the cups, you know, there's a lot of pink in the wands, but when we get into the cups, there's sort of a pale blue cast to everything. But again, you know, differences between the artwork are very, very minimal. Like here, I think her skin tone is a slight bit darker in the third edition than it was in the second edition, but it's so subtle, you can barely discern it. And in most of the cards, you really can't discern a difference at all. I've always liked this Eight of Cups. This is one of the rare Eight of Cups. I always prefer there to be water in my Eight of Cups, but I've always really liked this one where she's kind of going down this pathway between the trees. I just think it's a really cool image. You know, I'm going through these pretty quickly because, again, as you can see in most of the cards, the artwork itself is the same. And it's just a question of whether or not you prefer the dark borders or the white borders. I personally think I prefer the dark borders, even though the white borders will probably hide any chipping better. And I do think that the cardstock is higher quality in the newer edition, the second or the third edition. When we get into the swords, you can see everything is kind of a darker blue undertone to all the artwork, which I really like. Another thing that I've always really liked about this deck is that there's gender balance in the knights and the pages. Some of the suits have female knights and pages, and some of them have male knights and pages. So, this Three of Coins I've always felt like is so creepy. Like this is the one card in the deck that I'm not actually a huge fan of, because these dudes just look amazingly creepy to me. Like, I don't know what it is. Like, they make me almost think of Mr. Croup and Mr. Vandemar in Neverwhere by Neil Gaiman. Like, for some reason, that's just what they make me think of. Like, that's what they remind me of. I don't know why, but I just find them super, super creepy. I do like how many dogs there are in this deck. The Five of Coins is a dog. The Sun is a dog. When we get to the 10 of Coins, you'll see that that one's a dog. But it is a beautiful deck, and I do plan to keep the third edition, because again, this is a deck I use a lot, and I'm perfectly happy to have a backup copy of this deck. because I would be very heartbroken if anything happened to my copy and I didn't have another one to use. But here's our last card, the King of Coins. But again, I am pretty sure from an aesthetic standpoint, I do prefer the darker look of the second edition. I just feel like in the third edition, you know, the borders just stand out quite a bit more. Your eye tends to be drawn to the borders as opposed to the artwork, which isn't the case in the second edition. And I prefer the darker aesthetic for this deck. I mean, it is called the Darkness of Light, and I've always liked how, you know, the aesthetic in the second edition is that there is this overall dark aesthetic with the light in the picture, you know, really being the thing that draws your eye. So, but that said, again, I do think that the cardstock is a higher quality in the third edition. So there's definitely things to recommend both. And also there are lots of people who very well may prefer the lighter colors of the third edition. It just kind of depends on, you know, what you like in terms of an aesthetic. It's certainly still a beautiful deck. The artwork is close to identical. There haven't been any major changes in the imagery. There's a few cards where the overall tonality is the slightest bit different, but it's so subtle you can barely even tell. I mean, it's still a very beautiful, usable deck in this third edition with the lighter aesthetic to it. It shuffles very nicely. So, and again, I do feel like this cardstock is slightly higher quality in this edition. I'm just going to go ahead and do a comparison shuffle with my second edition. Now, the reason why the cardstock might feel a little stiffer to me also in the third edition is because, you know, I've used this deck a fair amount, my second edition, and so it might be that it's just broken in a little bit more, but I do think that the cardstock is slightly different in the third edition, and I do think it is improved over the second edition. But they both shuffle perfectly nicely. You know, and there's, you know, strong reasons to recommend both editions of this deck. I think they're both lovely. I honestly really prefer this one. So, anyway, so that is my comparison video between the second and third editions of the Darkness of Light Tarot. Again, what we have here is we have a lighter aesthetic in the third edition and a darker aesthetic in the older second edition. I personally know which one I prefer, but you know, it's going to be up to any given individual as to which one they might like better. But I do think that there's definitely been an improvement in the cardstock with this newer version. So anyway, thanks so much for watching, everybody. Have a great one. Bye-bye.